Today, we are going to talk about one of the most devastating economic events in modern history, the Great Depression. It began in 1929 and lasted through most of the 1930s. At its worst, millions of people around the world had no job, no money, and no clear hope for the future. It changed how governments think about economics, and its lessons are still studied carefully today.
I have heard the name before, but I always thought of it as an American problem. Was it really a global event?
Very much a global event. It started in the United States, but it spread rapidly across the world through trade connections and banking systems. Countries in Europe, Latin America, Asia, and beyond all felt its effects deeply. No part of the world economy was truly isolated from what happened.
And it was not just an economic crisis, was it? It had political consequences, too.
Enormous political consequences. The Great Depression helped bring extreme political movements to power in several countries, contributing directly to the conditions that led to the Second World War. To understand the 20th century, you really have to understand the Great Depression. So let us start at the beginning, in the decade before the crash.
So what was happening in America before the Depression began?
The period from roughly 1920 to 1929 is often called the Roaring Twenties. After the suffering and sacrifice of the First World War, America entered a period of remarkable economic growth and cultural energy. New industries were booming. The automobile industry was expanding rapidly. Electricity was reaching more and more homes. New consumer products like radios, refrigerators, and washing machines were being sold to ordinary families for the first time.
So people were genuinely becoming wealthier.
Many people were, yes. The middle class was growing. Department stores were full of goods. Advertising became a major industry, encouraging people to buy more and more. A new culture of consumption was taking shape. People were spending, and they were borrowing money to spend even more. Credit, the idea of buying now and paying later, became widespread for the first time.
And the stock market was part of this boom as well.
A very big part. The stock market became almost a national obsession during the 1920s. Ordinary people who had never invested before were buying shares in companies, often using borrowed money. Stock prices kept rising, which encouraged more people to invest, which pushed prices higher still. There was a widespread belief that the market would simply keep going up forever.
That sounds like a dangerous assumption.
Extremely dangerous. And while the cities were celebrating, there were serious warning signs that many people chose to ignore. Agriculture was one of the biggest problems. During the First World War, American farmers had expanded production enormously to feed Europe. But after the war, European agriculture recovered and demand for American farm products fell sharply. Farmers were left with too much production and falling prices. Many farm families were already in financial difficulty throughout the 1920s, even while the cities were booming.
So not everyone was sharing in the prosperity.
Far from it. And the industrial sector had its own problems too. Factories were producing more goods than people could actually afford to buy in the long run. Much of the consumer spending of the 1920s was supported by debt rather than real income growth. The foundation of the boom was far less solid than it appeared on the surface.
And then came the crash.
On October 24, 1929, a date remembered as Black Thursday, stock prices on the New York Stock Exchange began to fall sharply. Panic spread among investors. Everyone tried to sell at the same time. The following days brought further catastrophic falls. On October 29th, known as Black Tuesday, the market collapsed completely. Billions of dollars of value simply disappeared in a matter of days. People who had borrowed money to invest found themselves owing far more than their investments were now worth. The Roaring Twenties ended not with a gentle slowdown, but with a violent crash that echoed around the world.
So the stock market crashed. But how did that turn into a crisis for ordinary people who had never invested in stocks?
That is exactly the right question to ask. The stock market crash by itself was devastating for investors, but the deeper crisis came from what it did to the banking system. And the banking system touched everyone, including people who had never bought a single share of stock.
How did the banking system become involved?
Banks had been lending money generously throughout the 1920s to businesses, to investors, and to ordinary consumers. When the stock market crashed and businesses started to fail, many of those loans could not be repaid. Banks began to suffer serious losses. And then something happened that turned a financial crisis into a full economic catastrophe. People panicked and rushed to take their money out of the banks.
That is what a bank run is, right?
Exactly. A bank run happens when large numbers of people try to withdraw their deposits at the same time. Banks do not actually keep all their depositors' money sitting in a vault. They lend most of it out. So when everyone wants their money back at once, the bank simply does not have enough cash on hand to pay everyone. Banks began to fail across the country. Thousands of American banks collapsed between 1929 and 1933.
And when a bank failed, people lost all the money they had saved.
All of it, yes. There was no deposit insurance at that time. If your bank failed, your savings were simply gone. Families who had spent decades carefully saving money lost everything in a single day. The human suffering this caused was immense and immediate.
And then businesses started to close as well.
As banks failed, credit dried up completely. Businesses that needed loans to operate or expand could no longer get them. Consumer spending collapsed because people had lost their savings or their jobs or both. Factories cut production and then closed entirely. The unemployment rate in the United States, which had been around 3% before the crash, rose to nearly 25% by 1933. 1 in 4 American workers had no job.
25%. That is an extraordinary number.
An almost unimaginable level of unemployment. And the effects spread far beyond the unemployed workers themselves. Families lost their homes when they could not pay their mortgages. People stood in long lines outside soup kitchens, waiting for a bowl of food. Children went hungry. The psychological impact on people who had worked hard their entire lives and suddenly found themselves unable to provide for their families was devastating.
You mentioned places called Hoovervilles. What were those?
As families lost their homes, many had nowhere to go. Groups of homeless people began building makeshift shelters from whatever materials they could find. Scraps of wood, cardboard, metal sheeting, on the outskirts of cities and in public parks. These temporary settlements were called Hoovervilles, named mockingly after President Herbert Hoover, who was widely blamed for failing to respond adequately to the crisis.
So people were angry at the government.
Very angry. Hoover believed strongly that the government should not directly intervene in the economy, that the market would eventually correct itself if left alone. He resisted calls for large-scale government relief programs. As the Depression deepened and millions suffered, his insistence on this approach made him deeply unpopular. The Hoovervilles were a visible symbol of that anger. Shanty towns of desperate people living in the shadows of the wealthiest country in the world.
And this crisis was not limited to the United States.
It spread rapidly. American banks called in loans they had made to European countries. American consumers stopped buying imported goods. American companies stopped investing abroad. Country after country felt the effects. Germany, which was already struggling with war reparations debts, was hit particularly hard. International trade collapsed by more than 60% between 1929 and 1932. The entire global economic system was in crisis simultaneously.
So millions of people had already lost their jobs and their savings. Was there anything else that made the situation even worse?
Unfortunately, yes. Just as the economic crisis was devastating American cities and towns, a separate, but equally catastrophic disaster was unfolding across the agricultural heartland of the country. The Central Plains of the United States, covering parts of Oklahoma, Texas, Kansas, Colorado, and other surrounding states, were hit by a severe and prolonged drought combined with massive dust storms. This environmental disaster became known as the Dust Bowl.
How did the dust storms happen? Was it purely a natural disaster?
It was a combination of natural conditions and human choices that made each other far worse. For decades before the 1930s, farmers had plowed up the native grasses that had covered the plains for thousands of years. Those deep-rooted grasses had held the soil in place even during dry periods. When farmers replaced them with wheat and other crops, the soil became vulnerable. When the drought came and the crops failed, there was nothing left to anchor the topsoil.
So the soil just blew away.
In enormous quantities. The winds of the plains picked up millions of tons of loose, dry topsoil and carried it into massive dark clouds that could be seen from hundreds of kilometers away. These storms, called black blizzards, rolled across the landscape and buried farms, homes, and entire towns under deep drifts of dust. People caught outside during a major storm could become disoriented and suffocate. Children developed a respiratory illness called dust pneumonia from breathing the contaminated air.
That sounds absolutely terrifying to live through.
Survivors described the experience as apocalyptic. Imagine waking up in the morning and finding your home buried to the windowsills in dust. Imagine watching the sky turn completely black in the middle of the afternoon as a wall of dust hundreds of meters high moved toward you. The worst storms carried dust all the way to the east coast of the United States. Dust settled on ships in the Atlantic Ocean, hundreds of kilometers from land.
And the farmers in these areas had already been struggling economically before the drought hit.
Yes, which made their situation truly desperate. Many farm families had already taken on debt during the 1920s to buy equipment and expand their land. When crop prices fell and then the drought destroyed what little they could grow, they had no way to repay those debts. Banks foreclosed on their farms. Families who had worked the same land for generations were suddenly left with nothing.
And then they had to leave.
Hundreds of thousands of families packed whatever they could carry into old cars and trucks and joined a massive migration westward, particularly toward California, which they hoped would offer agricultural work and a better life. These migrants were often called Okies, a term originally referring to people from Oklahoma, but used more broadly for all the displaced families moving west, sometimes as an insult by people who resented their arrival.
Did they find what they were looking for in California?
Mostly not. California did have agricultural work, but there were far more desperate people looking for work than there were jobs available. Landowners could pay almost nothing, and migrants had no choice but to accept. Families lived in temporary labor camps in extremely poor conditions, moving from harvest to harvest, never earning enough to build a stable life. They were often treated with contempt and hostility by local communities who feared the competition for scarce jobs.
You mentioned a novel called The Grapes of Wrath. How does that connect to this story?
John Steinbeck was an American author who traveled among the migrant communities of California and witnessed their conditions firsthand. He published The Grapes of Wrath in 1939, telling the story of the Joad family, an Oklahoma farm family driven west by the Dust Bowl and the Depression. The novel captured the dignity and suffering of these displaced families with great power and compassion. It became one of the most important American novels of the 20th century and helped many middle-class readers understand the human reality behind the economic statistics.
So literature played a role in building public awareness of the crisis.
A significant role. Photography also played an important part. A government photographer named Dorothea Lange traveled through the migrant camps and took photographs that brought the faces of the Depression directly to the American public. Her most famous photograph, known as Migrant Mother, showing an exhausted woman with her children leaning against her, became one of the defining images of the entire era. These artistic and documentary works created an emotional connection between the suffering of the poor and the broader public that statistics alone could never achieve.
And all of this was happening at the same time as the broader economic collapse.
Simultaneously, the Dust Bowl and the Depression reinforced each other in a terrible cycle. Economic hardship made it impossible for farmers to invest in better land management. Environmental disaster deepened the economic crisis by destroying agricultural production. Millions of Americans were caught between two catastrophes at once, with very little help coming from the government. But that was about to change, because in 1932, Americans elected a new president who had very different ideas about what government should do in a crisis.
So who was this new president, and what did he plan to do differently?
Franklin Delano Roosevelt, known by his initials FDR, was elected president in November 1932 in a landslide victory. He defeated Herbert Hoover decisively. Americans were desperate for change, and Roosevelt offered it with confidence and energy. His inaugural address in March 1933 contained one of the most famous lines in American political history. He told the American people that the only thing they had to fear was fear itself.
That sounds like a very powerful message for people who had been suffering for years.
It was. And Roosevelt understood that restoring confidence was itself an important part of recovering from the Depression. One of his first acts as president was to address the banking crisis directly. He declared a bank holiday, temporarily closing all banks while the government assessed which ones were sound enough to reopen. Then he went on national radio and explained to ordinary Americans in simple and reassuring language what was happening and why it was safe to put their money back in the banks. It worked. When the banks reopened, the runs stopped.
So communication and trust were part of the solution.
A very important part. Roosevelt used radio broadcasts, which he called fireside chats, throughout his presidency, to speak directly to the American people in plain and friendly language. This direct communication helped maintain public confidence during very difficult times. But communication alone was not enough. Roosevelt needed concrete policies to address unemployment, economic collapse, and the suffering of millions of people.
And that is where the New Deal came in.
Yes, the New Deal was not a single program, but a large collection of policies, laws, and government agencies created between 1933 and 1939. Historians often describe its goals using three words beginning with R: relief, recovery, and reform.
What did each of those mean in practice?
Relief meant providing immediate help to people who were suffering. This included direct financial assistance to unemployed workers and their families, food programs, and support for people who had lost their homes. Recovery meant getting the broader economy moving again, stimulating production and employment. Reform meant changing the rules and systems that had allowed the crash to happen in the first place, so that a similar disaster would be less likely to occur again.
How did the government create jobs on a large scale?
Through massive public works programs. The government hired unemployed workers directly to build infrastructure across the country. Roads, bridges, schools, hospitals, post offices, parks, and dams were constructed by government-employed workers during the New Deal years. One of the most ambitious projects was the Tennessee Valley Authority, known as the TVA. which built a series of large dams along the Tennessee River.
What was the purpose of those dams?
The dams served multiple purposes simultaneously. They controlled flooding that had regularly devastated communities along the river. They generated hydroelectric power that brought electricity to rural areas of the American South that had never had it before. And the construction projects themselves employed thousands of workers during the worst years of the Depression. The TVA became a symbol of what active government intervention could achieve.
Were there other major programs beyond the construction projects?
Many others. The Civilian Conservation Corps put young unemployed men to work in national forests and parks, planting trees, building trails, and working on conservation projects. The Works Progress Administration employed not only construction workers, but also artists, writers, musicians, and theater performers, funding cultural projects across the country. The government recognized that cultural life was also part of what needed to be sustained during a national crisis.
And the Social Security Act was also part of the New Deal.
Yes, and this is perhaps the most enduring legacy of the entire New Deal period. The Social Security Act of 1935 created a system of old age pensions funded by contributions from workers and employers. For the first time, American workers had a guarantee of some income in retirement. The act also created unemployment insurance, providing temporary income support for workers who lost their jobs. These programs established the basic framework of what we now call the welfare state. The idea that government has a responsibility to provide a basic level of economic security for its citizens.
That was a very new idea at the time, was it not?
Radical by American standards. The United States had a strong tradition of believing that individuals should be responsible for their own welfare, and that government intervention in the economy was dangerous. The New Deal challenged that tradition fundamentally. Roosevelt argued that in a modern industrial economy, individuals could not always protect themselves against forces beyond their control, and that government had both the right and the responsibility to step in.
Did everyone support the New Deal?
Far from it. Roosevelt faced fierce opposition from business leaders and conservative politicians, who argued that the New Deal was socialist, that government intervention would destroy the free market, and that the massive spending would create dangerous levels of debt. The Supreme Court struck down several New Deal programs as unconstitutional. Roosevelt and his opponents fought bitterly throughout his presidency over the proper role of government in the economy.
And did the New Deal actually end the Depression?
This is a question economists still debate. The New Deal significantly reduced unemployment and stabilized the banking system. It restored confidence and prevented the situation from becoming even worse. But it did not fully end the Depression. In 1937, when Roosevelt reduced government spending out of concern about the growing national debt, the economy immediately contracted again, and unemployment rose sharply. Full economic recovery did not actually come until the United States began spending massively on military production in preparation for, and then during the Second World War.
So the New Deal helped, but did not fully end the Depression. How did the Depression finally end?
The answer is both simple and deeply uncomfortable. The Great Depression ended because of the Second World War. As the threat of war grew in Europe and Asia through the late 1930s, governments began spending enormous amounts of money on military preparation. In the United States, even before officially entering the war, the government began massively expanding its military production. And once America entered the war after Pearl Harbor in December 1941, the scale of that spending became truly enormous.
How did military spending end unemployment when the New Deal could not?
The scale was simply incomparable. The New Deal programs, large as they were, could not match the sheer volume of spending that wartime mobilization required. Factories that had been sitting idle for years suddenly received massive government contracts to produce ships, aircraft, tanks, weapons, uniforms, and every other kind of military supply. Not only were unemployed men hired, but women entered the workforce in enormous numbers to fill the jobs left by men who had gone to serve in the military.
The war achieved what the New Deal could not quite accomplish.
In purely economic terms, yes. By 1944, unemployment in the United States had fallen to below 2%. The economy was operating at full capacity and beyond. The painful irony is that the economic problem which the Depression represented was ultimately solved not by careful policy design, but by the catastrophic demands of the largest war in human history.
You mentioned that the Depression had political consequences in Europe. What happened there?
This is one of the most important and most tragic aspects of the Great Depression story. The economic crisis hit Europe extremely hard, particularly Germany. Germany was already struggling with the enormous debt of war reparations from the First World War. When the Depression struck, American banks recalled the loans they had made to Germany, and the German economy collapsed rapidly. Unemployment reached catastrophic levels.
And that created conditions for extreme political movements.
Exactly. When people are desperate, hungry, and humiliated, they become vulnerable to political leaders who offer simple explanations and simple solutions. Adolf Hitler and the Nazi Party offered Germans someone to blame for their suffering and a promise of national restoration and greatness. As the Depression deepened, support for the Nazis grew dramatically. Hitler came to power in 1933, the same year Roosevelt became President of the United States.
So the Depression in America and the rise of fascism in Europe happened at exactly the same time.
Simultaneously. And similar patterns appeared in other countries. Mussolini had already established his fascist dictatorship in Italy in the 1920s. In Japan, military leaders used economic hardship and nationalist sentiment to justify aggressive expansion in Asia. The Great Depression did not create fascism by itself, but it provided the economic misery and political instability that allowed extreme movements to gain power. In countries where democratic institutions were not yet deeply rooted.
So the Depression contributed to the conditions that led to the Second World War.
Very directly. This is one of the clearest examples in history of how economic catastrophe can have political consequences that extend far beyond economics. The financial decisions made on Wall Street in the 1920s and the policy failures that allowed the crash to spiral into a global depression ultimately contributed to a chain of events that killed tens of millions of people around the world.
After the war ended, did the world try to prevent another depression from happening again?
Yes, and this is where the story ends on a somewhat more hopeful note. Even before the war was over, the major Allied powers began planning for the post-war economic order. In July 1944, representatives from 44 countries gathered at a hotel in Bretton Woods, New Hampshire, in the United States, for a major international conference. The agreements they reached there are known as the Bretton Woods System.
What did the Bretton Woods system establish?
It established a new framework for international economic relations designed specifically to prevent the kind of collapse that had occurred in the 1930s. Two major international institutions were created. The International Monetary Fund, known as the IMF, was designed to provide financial support to countries experiencing economic difficulties, helping to prevent the kind of cascading banking failures that had spread the Depression globally. The World Bank was created to provide loans for reconstruction and development.
And there were also new rules for international trade and currency.
Yes, the Bretton Woods system established a fixed exchange rate system, where the value of most major currencies was tied to the United States dollar, and the dollar itself was tied to gold at a fixed price. This was designed to prevent the kind of competitive currency devaluations that had disrupted international trade during the Depression. When countries had repeatedly tried to make their exports cheaper by lowering the value of their own currency, which simply made everyone worse off.
Did the Bretton Woods system work?
For several decades, it worked remarkably well. The period from the late 1940s through the 1960s was one of the strongest and most broadly shared periods of economic growth in the history of the developed world. Unemployment stayed low. Living standards rose steadily. The catastrophic instability of the Depression era did not return. The system eventually broke down in the early 1970s, when the United States could no longer maintain the dollar's link to gold. But the institutions it created, the IMF and the World Bank, continue to operate today.
So the world genuinely learned something from the Depression and tried to build something better.
It did, though imperfectly. The Bretton Woods architects understood that economic instability was not just an economic problem. It was a political and security problem. A world of desperate and unstable economies was a world vulnerable to extremism and war. Building a more stable international economic system was therefore not just good economics. It was part of building a more peaceful world.
Looking at everything we have discussed, what is the most important lesson of the Great Depression?
I think there are several lessons that remain deeply relevant. The first is about the relationship between financial markets and the real economy. The 1920s showed how a financial boom built on borrowed money and speculation can create an illusion of prosperity that hides serious underlying problems. When that illusion collapses, the damage to real people and real communities can be enormous and long-lasting.
And the second lesson?
The second lesson is about the role of government. Before the Great Depression, many people believed that free markets were essentially self-correcting, that if the government simply stayed out of the way, economic problems would resolve themselves. The Depression demonstrated that this was not always true. Markets can fail in ways that require active government intervention to address. The New Deal and the Bretton Woods system both reflected this understanding.
But there were also debates about how much government intervention was appropriate.
Those debates never fully ended and continue today. How much should government intervene in the economy? How much debt is acceptable during a crisis? How do you balance immediate relief for suffering people with long-term fiscal responsibility? These are genuinely difficult questions with no single correct answer. The Depression experience gives us important evidence to work with, but it does not give us a simple formula.
What about the human dimension of the story? The families who lost everything, the migrants, the people in the Hoovervilles.
That human dimension is perhaps the most important thing to carry away. Economic crises are not just numbers on charts. They are people losing their homes, their savings, their dignity, and sometimes their hope. The statistics of the Depression, the unemployment rates, the bank failure numbers, the stock price graphs, represent millions of individual human stories of suffering and resilience. Behind every number, there was a family trying to survive.
And those families did survive.
Most of them did, through extraordinary resilience and mutual support. Communities came together. People helped their neighbors. Artists and writers documented the experience with honesty and compassion. And eventually, slowly, painfully, the world found its way back. The Great Depression tested democracy, tested capitalism, and tested the fundamental decency of human societies. The answers were not always perfect, but the world did not give up, and it did build something more stable from the wreckage. That is a story worth remembering. Thank you for joining us today.